Tandem OLED is here, and with it comes promises of higher brightness, less power usage, increased color volume and gamut coverage, and 60% higher lifespans than standard OLED panels. I've spent the past few weeks with the Asus ROG PG27AQWP-W, yikes, a 27-inch monitor with a crazy futuristic design that does 2K or 1440p at 540Hz or 720p at 720Hz, making this a very compelling piece of hardware for competitive gamers. We're going deep today, so even if this isn't the size you normally go for, high refresh at this level doesn't necessarily apply to you, we're still going to compare all the measurements and performance of Tandem against all the other OLED tech, and the results are surprising. Today's video is sponsored by Fractal Design and their Scape gaming headset. Available in both light and dark colorways, it's a clean, minimal aesthetic that blends right into your space, looking way more like a high-end pair of wireless headphones than a traditional gaming headset. The magnetic base uses wireless inductive charging, and it powers on just by picking it up. And while that base handles communication with your device, you can also just remove the portable dongle that's stored underneath, so you can move from your desk to your console in a different room without bringing the whole base with you. It uses a simple web-based interface with a really powerful parametric EQ. You can save those EQs to 3 different slots that travel with the headset and cycle through them on the hardware itself. And you don't have to do a lot to customize that audio, because this sounds solid right out of the box over the low latency wireless or via Bluetooth 5.3. You have a detachable flip down boom mic and onboard mics as well, so the Scape is equally at home in a gaming lobby as it is on a Zoom call in a professional setting. There's really subtle lighting that turns on or off with a single button press, and the controls and adjustments all have this syrupy, dampened action that feels very high end. Since its release, they've updated the side tone performance so you can hear your own voice back in your headset clearly, and they've unlocked additional volume overhead too, so it's great to see Fractal continuing to support and improve a product after launch. At $199.99, the Scape is an incredibly well-balanced audio solution that adds the perfect touch of clean, Scandi design to your space. For more info or to grab one for yourself, click the link down in the description. So the first thing you'll notice on this monitor is this crazy silver colorway and design features that create like this retro future aesthetic. We don't have finalized pricing just yet, but based on the market right now, I could see this coming in anywhere from like $1,100 to $1,300. A section of the rear case is completely transparent plastic with stylized internals. We still have the I logo on the rear with a variety of lighting options. The stand is the PG style, so the elevated leg style with all the lighting and downward projection. You can change the brightness or turn all of this off, but it's just the one color on the stand lighting. Outside of that, all the usual features of the PG stand, including going full vertical. Personally, I'm partial to the XG stand with its smaller base, as some part of the leg on these stands always ends up on top of my mouse pad if I'm not using a desk riser. I use a monitor arm most of the time, which Asus makes really easy with these with this included puck. Let me know in the comments what you think about this silver colorway. I think this is going to be really polarizing. I also noticed immediately that this is one of the very few OLED panels I've seen from Asus that doesn't utilize an external power brick, so they're clearly not worried about it creating too much heat inside the case. See, Tandem OLED goes by a lot of different names, including 4-stack, because we now have 4 layers, white and individual RGB, all producing light at the same time, so each layer doesn't need to be driven as hard, and this has a few benefits outside of power consumption. The first is brightness, and this panel is able to achieve a peak full-screen SDR brightness of 340 nits. The previous brightest OLEDs topped out at 265 nits on my equipment, so that is a massive increase of 28%, and I think it's safe to say that brightness is no longer an issue for OLED displays. Personally, I don't think it has been for a while, but 340 nits makes ELMB viable, which we'll talk about in a bit. The other specs that get a bump with Tandem are color volume and color coverage. LG's latest 3rd gen OLED came with a DCI-P3 coverage of 98%. QD OLED has always had a slight advantage here, with the best example I've personally tested coming in at 99.2. This monitor puts up a 99.7. I use Kalman Ultimate for all my monitor testing, and I've never measured color volume before, but I decided to include it in this video since it's such a marquee spec for Tandem, and it really helps illustrate why QD OLED has always been regarded as having brighter, more saturated colors. Here's what color volume looks like on 3rd gen W OLED versus Tandem, so you can see a massive improvement there. Based on my measurements though, QD OLED still takes it. The color accuracy is decent too for a factory calibration, and SDR I get an average delta ITP of just over 4. 3 is generally where we want to see this. Factory grayscale calibration is really strong. Our gamma is 2.187 against a goal of 2.2. Only the darkest blacks are a little higher than they should be. White point is 6431 against the target of 6500. Solid, no obvious color skew. Delta ITP variance is 2.17. Anything over 3 needs addressing. 1 is perfect, so this is great performance. Measuring this monitor was interesting because it's slow to heat up and it's very quick to cool down, and you're always going to get the best measurements when the panel is fully warm. Keeping it warm in between measurements was actually actually a challenge, and I think that says great things for longevity, but the numbers vary a lot when the panel's running cooler. And I have to wonder if just running it in a regular use case like gaming is going to keep it at an optimal temperature. It also seems to perform its best when at max brightness, which goes against the subjective eyeball test that we'll dig into later. The coating on this panel is the new true black glossy coating that we just saw on the latest dual mode 32-inch 4K monitors Asus just dropped, and it's really, really good. It doesn't have the grain that we see on matte W OLEDs, and it's got superior viewing angles without getting hazy. It also doesn't have the raised black issue that we see on QD OLED, where high light levels in your room can make the blacks look gray or purple. And it cuts down on ambient reflections, but at the end of the day, it's still a big black mirror, so direct reflections can still be a challenge. The black levels here look amazing. I think this is easily the best coating we've seen on OLED so far. But the big show with this monitor is being able to harness these improved OLED specs at 540 Hz 1440p. Quick note on that, the materials say you need to have a 50 series GPU to take advantage of 540p at 1440. I was able to get this to do 540 Hz at 1440p specifically on a 40 series card. Now, whether a 40 series card will actually hit frame rates like this is another conversation. It functions, but it's really limited. There's no options here for custom resolution, so if you want the best experience with this monitor, you really need to be on a 50 series card that can take advantage of DisplayPort 2.1. Because yes, this monitor does use DisplayPort 2.1a, the full fat 80 gig version. And they do include a cable, which is actually long enough to use this time around. You also get two HDMI 2.1 inputs, a headphone jack, and their KVM setup, but no USB-C for your laptop on this one, and no speakers. In addition to that DisplayPort cable, you also get an HDMI cable and a USB-B cable that comes in the zipper pouch. Now, for those of you thinking you won't need DSC with this monitor, think again. 540 at 1440p, especially with 10-bit color, is a huge amount of bandwidth. If you want to disable DSC and retain 10-bit RGB color, the max frame rate you'll get is 180. If you're good with 10-bit 422 or 8-bit, you can go all the way to 500 Hz, so not bad, honestly, for those of you that don't want to use DSC. Note that I did all this testing over DisplayPort 2.1, and you will need to set up custom resolutions in the NVIDIA control panel because these aren't displayed by the monitor by default. Normally, this monitor will show you 540 Hz and then essentially 270 Hz. That's a really important number because that allows for ELMB. Remember, that's our OLED tech that allows for greatly improved motion clarity, similar to like DIAC on a Zowie monitor, but it's not backlight strobing here because OLEDs don't have a backlight. On the OLED side, it's called black frame insertion, so you get a live frame, then a black frame, then a live frame, and so on. As we've seen before, this has a profound effect on motion clarity, but it also forces you to run the panel at half of whatever the native refresh rate is, and it cuts the brightness by around 50%. Except that with the increased brightness we get with Tandem, that still leaves us with 172 nits peak full screen SDR, meaning it's no longer a glorified tech demo. It's actually viable to use, and this is huge. Here's motion blur with the monitor at 540 Hz. That's seriously impressive, but remember, to get results this good, your game needs to be running at a locked 540 FPS. There's like a handful of games that'll do that at 1440p. Think CS, Valorant, Overwatch, but there's a fair amount of competitive games that can manage 270 FPS locked. Here's what 270 looks like without ELMB, and here's what it looks like on. This is crazy. So if your main game can't or won't hit a locked 540, you can lock the FPS at 270, turn ELMB on, and now you have essentially the same motion blur performance as 540 with all the benefits of OLED and at a decent usable brightness. It won't feel as smooth as 540, but it looks great. In the right use case, this is incredible. Just be aware that ELMB comes with a laundry list of things you can't use at the same time, so I always advise to use this on PC and not so much on console where you'd have to trade off variable refresh rate and HDR. The other area where I just can't get ELMB to work is in dual mode. This monitor does 720 Hz at 720p. Why not 1080p? Well, the answer is math. 1440p is a direct derivative of 720p. It's exactly 4 times, the same way 4K or UHD is exactly 4 times as large as 1080p. I will tell you 2 things about this mode. 1, the motion blur is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's like looking at a still frame. I can't show you this in a YouTube video, but if you can get a 1-to-1 lock with 720 FPS, it tickles your brain. Like, you can't really pin down exactly what it is you're seeing. It looks wild, and I totally understand now why people talk about 1000 Hz being the promised land for refresh rate. The other thing I'll tell you is that this resolution looks awful. The aliasing is awful. Even when you render it 2 times the panel resolution, use upscaling, whatever, same thing. This is almost specifically, I guess, for CS players, complete with the 4:3 display mode and 24.5-inch 16:9 simulated. The aspect control stuff works regardless of what mode you're in. The simulated 24.5 and the 1440p 540 mode looks great. No weird scaling issues, looks super clean. Note that you can't use ELMB with it, so you'll have some decisions to make on a game-by-game basis. Input latency here is very solid at 500 240 Hz, giving us 1.2 milliseconds against a perfect theoretical of 0.94. And because this is OLED, we still have that same sub 0.1 millisecond gray to gray. They're calling this one 0.02, but my measuring device doesn't get that granular. Nonetheless, speed is not going to be an issue here. Unfortunately, we do have VRR flicker here, which seems to just be a reality with OLED. There is a single level toggle for flicker reduction, which restricts the range of the variable refresh rate, but it doesn't seem to do much for me. HDR on this monitor is legit, a side effect of the increased brightness and color volume with Tandem and helped along by that true black coating. Of the available modes, console HDR and display HDR true black 500, not 400, are the ones to go with because they both have really nailed accuracy. We want this gray line as close to the yellow line as possible, and it doesn't get closer than that. The max brightness in these modes is around 600 nits on both, all the way until you get to a 25% window, and then we see the usual fall off. This monitor does have adjustable HDR, meaning you can bump the brightness and other stuff like saturation. In console HDR mode with the brightness maxed, I got this to hit 1459 nits, max 1% brightness, which is nuts. Now this is more of a tech demo because to run it like this means you're really sacrificing the accuracy. That's what the measurements say, but the option is here to adjust this however you want depending on what looks good to you. Subjectively, it's a solid experience too, even though we're not hitting 1000 nit 1 and 2%, with everything working together, or in tandem if you will, it's a great HDR experience. On the topic of burn-in, one of the big things they're talking about with Tandem is a 60% increase in lifespan over previous gen tech. Now, I have no way to verify that, but when you look at using less power, producing less heat, and distributing that load across 4 layers instead of 3, it seems like a logical side effect. Truth told, I haven't been worried about burn-in for a while anyway, because the amount of OLED care features baked into at least Asus monitors is deep. This one also has the new proximity detection where it puts a black screen up if you walk off and then it pops back on when you come back. That's great if you're somebody like me that gets up, gets easily distracted, and walks off leaving the display on for a while. Text looks really good here too, which is not something I usually say at 1440p, but they've really got it down. There is clear pixel edge here that honestly I don't really notice unless I zoom all the way in, and I do prefer the text on this side versus QD OLED, which still has some green and purple fringing around the edges sometimes. Alright, so at this point we know what the measurements say. But for a subjective real-world comparison, I set up a 27-inch 3rd Gen W OLED with matte coating, this 4th Gen Tandem with true black gloss, and their 27-inch 4K QD OLED running in 1440p. These are all in the same mode with all the same settings running max brightness, and the results here were pretty surprising. At first look, the Tandem was actually my least favorite because all that brightness made it look a little washed out versus the other two. It just didn't have quite that same deep black contrast feel we normally get with OLED. Easy enough, let's drop the brightness. 85 seems to get us the closest. If we pull it down any further, we start to impact the highlights like the headlight too much. I also feel like the colors are a little more saturated on the 3rd Gen. Now the difference between the Tandem and the QD OLED is way more striking. The QD OLED is a touch warmer in color, the blacks seem darker while the headlight seems brighter, but the way more obvious thing is that the colors are much more saturated out of the box on QD OLED, especially the reds. Which one you prefer is a matter of taste, but I am immediately drawn to the QD OLED in this example because for gaming, I definitely tend to lean toward more saturated. On both of these panels, you can adjust the saturation. In SDR, if we bring Tandem up 30% or bring the QD OLED down 30%, it's essentially the same image. In a dim or dark environment, I do think QD OLED gets the nod for contrast too, the difference between the darkest and the lightest areas. If we add a lot of ambient light to the room, the Tandem performs a bit better because it retains its black levels better. Now that's all SDR. In HDR, it flips, and now Tandem looks the best to me. Less overall brightness, but more saturated colors, and I did calibrate windows for HDR with both of these monitors. Big takeaways then, the Tandem still has more brightness overhead than anything we've seen so far. It also comes with colors looking much more neutral out of the box, though you can dial it up if you want with no issue because it has the color volume. I can't shake the impression though that when you run Tandem in the areas of brightness that the other two can't achieve, it negatively impacts the perception of contrast. This drove me a little crazy in testing because an easy fix to the black levels is to just bump the gamma to 2.4. Now instantly the black levels are fixed, but the highlights feel dull. The monitor doesn't measure correctly when you do this, so it's not really a fix, and it's only apparent in SDR mode. HDR looks amazing, but we're working with a sample size of 1, and it's a super early factory copy, so Asus may still have some tweaking to do here. It's way too early to say this about Tandem in general. So this particular monitor is going to be for a very specific user. I would not consider this an all-rounder. But they do have another 27-inch Tandem model coming out at the same time that tops out at 280 Hz 1440p. It comes with an XG stand and presumably a lower price point. Even though I've traditionally said that a 27-inch 1440p is the sweet spot, if you have a higher end GPU, I've really been enjoying the immersion of 4K 32-inch a lot more lately. I used to switch back and forth between 4K 32 and a high refresh 1440p, but with the new dual mode monitors, I don't even bother anymore. So unless you're sold on QD OLED, you may want to hold off on a new purchase if 32 is what you want, because Tandem seems to universally clear Gen 3 WOLED. Even without the increased brightness from Tandem, QD OLED still seems to be a very viable contender. I mean, OLED in general is already a phenomenal looking monitor tech, so if you have one that you like already, I can't see rushing out to replace it with Tandem. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next one. Stay up.